The day ends without a clear edge. Dishes dry on the rack while a light hum stays in the kitchen. Work is finished, yet something keeps moving inside the body. The clock changes numbers again. There is effort folded into the day, neatly and quietly. Emails sent, lists checked, meals arranged, voices answered. Nothing is missing, and still the room feels slightly unfinished. It shows up most when the house settles. A chair is pulled back under the table, and hands rest for a moment. The body keeps standing, as if there is one more thing to finish. Children may already be elsewhere, breathing evenly, doors half closed. The work done for them blends into the work done for everyone else. What remains is a quiet sense of having given much, without knowing where it landed. The light stays on, though no one is asking anything more right now here. Morning starts again before the body fully agrees. The floor is cool, and the kettle waits where it always does. Hands move by memory, reaching for cups, bread, a knife. There is work already lined up, even before names are spoken. Messages arrive, plans adjust, a schedule tightens without being announced. It all feels reasonable, even familiar. Between tasks, there are small pauses that do not last. A sip of coffee cools too quickly. The next thing is already waiting. Children move through the space with their own quiet urgency. A question is asked from another room. An answer is given while hands continue working. None of it feels heavy on its own. It is simply steady, layered, repeating. The day asks for attention in many small ways. By afternoon, effort becomes quieter, almost invisible. Things are done without being noticed, even by the one doing them. The body keeps track, even when the mind does not. There is a sense of carrying something unnamed. Not a problem, not a crisis. Just a low weight that does not set itself down. Tasks finish one by one, yet the feeling does not. A list reaches its end, but satisfaction does not arrive with it. The body stays slightly forward, as if listening. This is not failure. It does not come from doing things wrong. It comes from giving steadily, without pause or witness. The hands know this rhythm well. They continue even when there is no clear response. They know how to keep going. Late in the day, light shifts without ceremony. Windows hold a softer color. The work remains the same. There is no applause for these hours. No marker to say enough has been done. Only the quiet continuation of effort. Sometimes the body waits for a feeling that does not come. A clear sense of completion. A signal to rest. Instead, there is movement into the next thing. Dinner, laundry, another conversation. Life continues in a straight line. This is where the unsatisfied feeling lives. Not in a single moment, but in the space between effort and rest. The body keeps offering itself. Time, attention, care. Each one given without asking much back. Nothing here is dramatic. It is ordinary and persistent. It fills the hours quietly. By evening, tiredness settles into the shoulders. Not exhaustion, just a dull familiarity. The body knows this well. There is still care left to give. Still listening, still responding. Still moving forward. The day does not explain itself. It simply continues. And the body continues with it. This kind of effort rarely announces its presence. It blends into routine. It becomes easy to overlook. There are no sharp edges to notice. Only smooth repetition. Days stacked gently on each other. Even pride feels muted here. There is little space for it. The rhythm keeps going. What remains is a quiet endurance. Not heroic, not praised. Simply present. The body learns to carry this without complaint. It becomes part of the posture. Shoulders adjust slightly. There is still more to be done. There always is. The evening waits. Light fades without asking anything. The work remains nearby. Nothing demands attention right now. Later, the work changes shape but not weight. The desk becomes a counter, the counter becomes a table. Hands move from one surface to another without fully stopping. There is a familiar sound of things being placed down. Keys, a bag, a phone turned face down. Each object lands softly, as if not to disturb the pace. Voices return in small waves. Questions about the day, remarks about nothing important. Responses come easily, even when energy thins. The body knows how to answer while doing something else. It has practiced this for years. Attention splits without complaint. Food is prepared with the same steady care. Nothing elaborate, nothing rushed. Just enough to carry everyone through the evening. The effort here feels invisible. Not hidden, just unmarked. It passes through the hands and disappears. There is a moment when someone laughs. Another moment when someone sighs. The day loosens slightly, then tightens again. Plates are cleared, surfaces wiped. The order returns quietly. It feels necessary, even when no one asks. This is when the sense of dissatisfaction grows clearer. Not sharp, not loud. Just a low hum under the noise of living. The body notices it while standing still. Waiting for water to boil. Waiting for a message that may not come. There is effort here that cannot be measured. Care given without a receipt. Time spent without a clear ending. Sometimes there is a brief thought of stopping. Not quitting, just resting. The thought passes without settling. Children drift toward their own spaces. Doors close halfway. The house rearranges itself. The work does not fully leave. It changes into listening, into presence, into being available without words. This kind of availability asks quietly. It does not demand attention. It assumes it will be met. The body answers out of habit. Out of love, perhaps. Out of practice more than decision. There is no complaint in this. Only a growing tiredness that stays polite. It does not interrupt. Lights are turned on one by one. Shadows move along familiar walls. The evening settles. Still, something remains unfinished. Not a task. A feeling that does not resolve. It is not disappointment. Not frustration either. It is softer than that. More like a question without words. A sense of giving without arrival. Of effort without landing. The body feels it most when sitting down. When the chance to stop finally appears. Muscles hesitate before relaxing. There is a habit of staying ready. As if something else will be needed. As if rest might be temporary. Even in stillness, attention stays slightly forward. Listening for footsteps. For a call from another room. This posture has been learned slowly. Built from many evenings like this. Ordinary and unremarked. The unsatisfied feeling does not accuse. It simply stays close. Waiting alongside the body. Nothing is wrong in this moment. Nothing is missing in any obvious way. Life continues evenly. The room holds quiet activity. Clocks, distant sounds, breathing. Everything moves as expected. And still, the sense of effort lingers. Like warmth left in the hands. Long after the task is done, there is a quieter stretch that comes after the movement slows. Not rest yet, but something softer than effort. The house holds itself differently. A chair receives the body without comment. The back leans in, then stops halfway. Still ready. Sounds thin out. A screen murmurs in another room. Water runs briefly, then goes quiet. This is where attention begins to turn inward, without intention. The body notices its own weight. How it presses into the seat. Breath moves in a steady pattern. Nothing special about it. Just there. The unsatisfied feeling does not grow here. It does not disappear either. It changes shape. It becomes less like a question and more like a space. An open place where something could land. But nothing does. Hands rest on the knees. They feel slightly warm. They have done enough for today. The mind wanders without urgency. Small thoughts pass through. They do not ask to be followed. There is a memory of effort without detail. No specific task stands out. Only the sense of having been occupied. This is not the sharp tiredness of overwork. It is quieter, more diffuse. A tiredness that has learned to stay calm. The body has been here before. Many evenings carry this same texture. It recognizes the moment. Somewhere nearby, a light clicks off. Another stays on. The balance feels right. Presence arrives slowly. Not as a decision. As a settling. The body stops leaning forward. Shoulders drop a fraction. Nothing dramatic. This is often when satisfaction is expected. When effort should soften into something warm. When completion should be felt. Instead, there is neutrality. A simple being here. Neither pleased nor displeased. The unsatisfied feeling loosens its edges. It no longer presses. It rests alongside. There is a sense of having given without checking the result. Of caring without measuring return. The body does not judge this. It simply notices. Like noticing the room temperature. Like noticing the light outside fading. Time stretches slightly. Minutes pass without being counted. The clock becomes less important. This is quiet presence. Not silence, but less demand. Less pulling. The body allows itself to be supported by the chair. Fully now. It exhales more completely. Nothing asks to be solved. Nothing asks to be improved. The moment holds. There is room here for tiredness. Room for contentment that does not announce itself. Room for not knowing how the day adds up. The unsatisfied feeling no longer seeks an answer. It sits, unbothered. It belongs to this hour. A small sound passes through the house. Footsteps, distant. Then stillness again. The body does not follow. It stays where it is. Present enough. This is not the end of effort. Tomorrow will ask again. The body knows this. For now, there is a pause that does not demand explanation. Just a moment allowed to exist. Held gently, the room breathes with the body. Light, air, weight. All steady. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be taken away. The moment stays. As the evening deepens, the house grows less talkative. Rooms hold their shapes without asking for anything. The body moves through them more slowly now. There is a cup placed somewhere nearby. It cools without being noticed. Steam disappears on its own. This is a quieter kind of awareness. Not focused, not drifting. Just present enough to notice small shifts. The unsatisfied feeling rests differently here. It is no longer tied to effort. It feels more like space around the effort. The body senses how much has been carried. Not as a list. As a general weight that has been familiar for years. Care has filled the day in ordinary ways. Listening, responding, remembering small preferences. These things leave no clear mark when finished. They fade as soon as they are done. Like footprints on a floor that is wiped clean. Nothing remains to point to. The body sits with this absence without naming it. There is no need to. It has learned this rhythm. Light pools in certain corners of the room. Other corners stay dim. The balance feels intentional, even if it is not. Time feels wider here. There is less urgency to move it along. Moments stretch gently. The unsatisfied feeling becomes quieter than thought. It settles into the background. Almost like a familiar sound. There is no urge to push it away. No effort to replace it with something else. It is allowed to stay. This allowance changes the texture of the moment. The body softens without instruction. Breathing slows a little. There is space to notice small comforts. The steadiness of the floor. The support of the chair. Nothing about this is dramatic. No realization arrives. No conclusion forms. It is simply a pause inside the ongoing giving. A place where the body is not asked to offer more. At least for now. Thoughts pass through without weight. They do not stay long enough to matter. They move like air. The unsatisfied feeling no longer feels personal. It feels shared, even unnamed. As if many evenings carry the same tone. The body recognizes this as a common hour. One that repeats across days and lives. Quiet and uncelebrated. There is a sense of continuity here. Not progress. Just ongoing presence. Care does not end when tasks end. It lingers as attention. As readiness. The body notices how often it stays open. Even when nothing is asked. Even when rest is allowed. This openness has a cost, but also a softness. It keeps the day from closing too tightly. It leaves space. The unsatisfied feeling fits into that space now. Not as lack. As room. There is nothing to fill it with. Nothing waiting to arrive. The space itself is enough. A distant sound passes through the house. A door closing far away. Then quiet again. The body remains where it is. Not preparing for the next thing. Not reviewing the last. Just here, held by the evening. Effort behind it. Stillness ahead. Night approaches without announcing itself. It arrives through small changes. The way sounds travel farther. The way light becomes selective. Only certain surfaces still catch it. Others release it quietly. The body notices this shift even before naming it. Movement slows on its own. Steps become softer. There is less need to finish anything now. Tasks have already loosened their grip. What remains is presence. A blanket is adjusted. A lamp is turned lower. These actions carry no urgency. The unsatisfied feeling is still nearby. It has changed again. Now it feels thinner. More like air than weight. Something felt rather than held. It moves with the breath. The body allows this without resistance. There is no search for replacement. No attempt to define it. This hour does not ask for answers. It does not reward effort. It simply holds what arrives. The house settles into familiar night sounds. A distant hum. An occasional creak. These sounds have always been here. They ask nothing. They continue regardless of attention. The body rests within this continuity. Not fully asleep. Not fully alert. Thoughts slow down. They pass without forming lines. They dissolve before finishing. The unsatisfied feeling blends into this slowing. It no longer stands apart. It becomes part of the atmosphere. Like dim light. Like evening air. Present but not demanding. Care still exists here. Not as action. As quiet availability. The body knows how to stay open. It has practiced this for years. Often without noticing. This openness is not effort now. It is simply how the body rests. How it remains. Time becomes less structured. Minutes loosen their edges. The clock loses importance. There is no need to measure the day. No need to weigh its value. It has already passed. The unsatisfied feeling does not follow the day forward. It stays with the present moment. Unattached to outcome. The body feels supported by stillness. Not held tightly. Just allowed. Breathing deepens slightly. Without instruction. Without decision. This is not resolution. It is something quieter. A soft landing. The body no longer waits for satisfaction. It does not look for it. It does not miss it. There is space to simply exist. To be carried by the hour. To remain unclaimed. The unsatisfied feeling fits here without conflict. It no longer asks to be changed. It no longer interrupts. It rests as sensation only. A gentle reminder of having lived the day. Nothing more. The room holds steady. Walls, floor, air. All familiar. The body trusts this familiarity. It releases its watchfulness. Just a little. No conclusion forms. No meaning arrives. The night does not require them. Stillness deepens naturally. Like water settling after movement. Without instruction. The body follows. Not all at once. Enough. Night is fully present now. Not announced, just settled. The house has found its quiet shape. Lights are fewer. The air feels cooler against the skin. Even familiar rooms seem to hold more space. The body lies down without ceremony. No checklist follows. No review of what was done. This is the hour where effort no longer makes sense. Not because it was wrong, but because it has already passed. The unsatisfied feeling is still here. It has followed gently. It does not resist the dark. In this depth of quiet, it feels different again. Less like something missing. More like a residue of motion. The body notices it the way it notices warmth left in sheets. A trace. A sign of having been present. Breathing becomes deeper without instruction. The chest rises slowly. Then releases. There is no need to hold the day together anymore. It can loosen. It can scatter. Thoughts come in fragments now. Images without sequence. Sounds without meaning. A hallway light seen earlier. A voice from the afternoon. The weight of keys in a pocket. None of these ask to be resolved. They drift through. They fade. The unsatisfied feeling does not attach to them. It floats nearby. Unclaimed. In this stillness, the body recognizes something familiar. Not satisfaction. Not relief. But permission. To stop trying to feel complete. To stop checking. The night does not require wholeness. It does not measure output. It holds everything equally. Care softens here. It turns inward without effort. Like hands finally unclenching. The body feels heavier against the bed. Gravity does the work now. Nothing else is needed. The unsatisfied feeling settles into this weight. It no longer feels separate. It becomes part of resting. There is no story attached to it. No explanation. Just sensation. The body does not mind this. It has learned that not every feeling needs closure. Some simply pass through. Outside, distant sounds continue. A car far away. Wind moving somewhere unseen. These sounds do not interrupt. They blend into the dark. They remind the body it is not alone. Time stretches wide here. Minutes lose their edges. The clock is no longer consulted. The unsatisfied feeling fades in importance. Not because it disappears, but because nothing is required of it. The body rests with it as it is. No effort. No correction. Sleep does not arrive all at once. It comes gradually. In layers. Muscles soften. Jaw loosens. The day releases its grip. The unsatisfied feeling slips further into the background. It becomes indistinct. Like a sound remembered but not heard. This is deep stillness. Not empty. Just quiet enough. The body remains here without expectation. Held by the bed. Held by the dark. Nothing needs to be finished now. Nothing waits for an answer. The night continues on its own. Breath moves. The body follows. The rest can wait. Night holds the room without asking anything. The body stays where it is, neither reaching nor retreating. Breath moves on its own. Somewhere, effort finally loosens its grip. Not because it was seen or praised. Only because it is no longer needed. The unsatisfied feeling drifts nearby, lighter now. It does not need a name. It does not need to leave. The house keeps its quiet agreements. Floors stay steady. Walls keep their distance. There is nothing to add to this hour. Nothing waiting to be understood. Nothing that requires improvement. The body rests inside what remains. Not full. Not empty. Just here, long enough. The night continues. So does the breath. Time settles without direction. Minutes pass quietly, uncounted. Nothing is gathered, nothing is lost. The day no longer needs to be held. It has already moved on. What was given stays given. The body trusts the dark to do its work. Muscles soften in their own time. No signal is required. Even the unsatisfied feeling grows quiet here. It blends into the background. Like a sound remembered after sleep. There is space for tomorrow to remain unnamed. No planning, no rehearsal. Just distance enough. The room breathes alongside the body. Air moves, then rests. Nothing follows. This moment does not ask to be kept. It does not ask to be shared. It stays as it is. Night continues without witness, and the body remains, quiet enough to stay. Breath comes, goes, and nothing else arrives now here softly.